in saying for a petition for start.
Hello and welcome. I am Ellie Richardson and you are watching The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he deeply regrets appointing Peter Mandelson as Britain's ambassador to the United States, adding that Mandelson has betrayed the country, Parliament and the Labour Party. Former US President Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton agreed to testify in the congressional investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, allowing them to avoid being found in contempt of Congress. Russian Foreign Ministry says they hope that during the meeting between Iran and US scheduled for Friday, steps will be taken to prevent further escalation, adding that issue of removal uranium from Iran is still on the table. China's Xi Jinping and Russia's Vladimir Putin praises their partnership in a video call on Wednesday, calling ties a stabilizing force amid global turmoil and pledging deeper cooperation ahead of the Ukraine war anniversary. White House confirms India's $500 billion US investment plan. US Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt makes a statement. The US military shot down an Iranian drone after it aggressively approached the USS Abraham Lincoln in Arabian Sea. Washington says talks with Iran remain scheduled this week despite the incident. The death toll after a gunman raided Woro, a remote village in Kwara State, has now risen to 162. Residents describe it as the deadliest attack in the area this year. Amid restrictions at Rafah, at least 10 Palestinians, including children, killed in Israeli attack across Gaza since early morning, as per reports. And for your top stories this hour, the US and Iran are now set to hold crucial talks in Oman this Friday to seek de-escalation on nuclear issues. Iran requested a change of venue to avoid expanding the discussion to its ballistic missile program, which Tehran insists remains off the table. The talks come amid growing tensions with incidents such as the US drowning an Iranian drone and close encounters in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has also warned against further threats to its security, while US President Donald Trump has stated that bad things could happen if an agreement is not reached. The diplomatic efforts aim to prevent further conflict as the US continues to build up military forces in the region, and both sides remain at odds over key issues such as uranium enrichment and missile development. We are now being joined by Dan Perry from Tel Aviv, who's an international affairs expert. Thank you so much for joining us here today on NewsX World. What strategic purpose does holding nuclear talks in Oman at Tehran's request serve for both the United States and Iran, especially as tensions rise in the Gulf?
That depends on whether the Trump administration is sincere in being willing to not attack Iran as they had threatened, and instead suffice with some manner of a deal, even if it's just on nuclear enrichment. Remember that when Trump told Iranian protesters to continue protesting and to take over their institutions and to risk their lives because help is on its way, and I quote, help is on its way, that was not about a nuclear deal. That was about the fact that their government is horrifically oppressive and illegitimate and overwhelmingly unpopular. And it turned out murderous. Trump, after the bombardment of Iran in June of last year, said he doesn't need a deal. He said the entire nuclear program had been obliterated and we don't even need a deal, and I quote. Others were saying, including myself, that this is the moment to demand surrender terms of Iran because they were very much on the back foot. And those surrender terms should be not just involving nuclear enrichment at an above civilian level of 5%, uh, an issue that Trump claimed had been resolved, but also that they should cease their development of ballistic missiles. You don't need ballistic missiles for defense, and that they should cease supporting, training, funding militias all over the Arab world that foment instability and export jihadism and war. Now, these are reasonable demands, and no country has the right to interfere in its environment this way. And Trump had no interest in that. So if the talks right now are just about the nuclear issue, I'm puzzled. If they're about the bigger issue, that might make some sense. But in any case, it is a departure from the entire narrative of last month, where Trump warned the Iranian government that they would face American retribution in action if they massacred their own people, which they most definitely proceeded to do.
How do ongoing disagreements, such as Iran's insistence on limiting talks to its nuclear program and rejecting conditions on ballistic missiles, reflect deeper mistrust between Washington and Tehran, and can these be bridged?
Look, I should think the distrust could hardly be deeper on both sides. If America is consistent with what it has viewed as its role in the world as something of a global policeman and a leader of the free world and a protector of its allies in the Middle East, and that includes not just Israel, but the moderate Arab countries, mostly Sunni Arab countries, but also Iraq, then Iran shouldn't trust America, because America should be desiring regime change in Iran, which would be a huge favor to the Iranian people. Meanwhile, should the Americans trust Iran? That would be unbelievably foolhardy. The regime, is predictable in many ways, including that they are not beholden to the truth in their international relations and declarations. So the mistrust is obviously there. Why Iran wants to limit it to nuclear is clear. Iran would limit it to discussing what day of the week it is if they only could. Question is why the U.S. would suffice with that. And I think the answer may be rather unfortunate for anyone who would like to see a free and democratic Iran, which is, for 80 years in the U.S., we have had a bipartisan consensus that we should promote democracy and we should prefer democracies, and that in general, all people want freedom, and freedom begets prosperity. Trump has blown that up. Trump prefers autocracies. He loves dictators if they're winners. He disdains America's democratic allies, mocks them, and in the case of Denmark, even threatened force implicitly if they didn't give him Greenland. I mean, Trump is a whole other thing, and he may not necessarily care that much if the regime in Iran falls. This is a real ace in the hole for the Islamic Republic. They may be thinking, and I assess that they are, that if they throw Trump a bone, if they maybe get rid of some expendable officials, if they agree to, limit nuclear enrichment, maybe he lets them survive. But for the countries of the region and for the people of Iran, letting the Islamic Republic survive would be a lamentable missed opportunity and a huge disservice to humanity at large.
And given that previous round of talks, we've only heard that there's been some but not conclusive progress from previous talks. What realistic outcomes can we expect from this time round? And would it be a de-escalation, framework for future deals, or something more substantive?
What Iran wants is for the threat of force against them to be taken off the table, despite the fact that they massacred untold thousands of people in stamping out the protests. Any kind of deal that achieves that for Iran would be a betrayal by the West of the obligations implicit from Trump's having encouraged protesters to go out there, apparently to go out there and be killed. So that is what Iran wants. A plausible way out, I suppose, would be if Iran were to agree to limit nuclear enrichment to, let's say, 5%. And that would be civilian usage. Anything above 5% or significantly above it is indefensible as a civilian. You don't need it for civilian use. And Trump could spin that into a big success. It's conceivable that he tried to do that. All of that would be counter to the logic that Trump himself deployed in his first term when he walked away from the nuclear deal, basically saying Iran couldn't be trusted. And by the way, that was a terrible mistake because at the time, most foreign intelligence agencies, including Israel's Mossad, the UN nuclear agency, said Iran was abiding by the terms of that deal. As a result of the US walking away from the deal because Obama had done the deal, Iran resumed enrichment and became a nuclear threshold state, which required the war last June. So it's a little bit difficult to trust Trump to prosecute these matters in a way that is strategic and thoughtful and even genuine. Trump is probably going to try to come up with something that he can spin as a massive success and claim it's the ninth war that he has stopped or prevented.
Thank you, Dan. Don't go too far, as we will come back to you in just a moment. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin hold their first meeting of the year as Beijing and Moscow plan to boost strategic alignment amid increasing geopolitical tensions around the globe. Xi talked to Putin for working towards a grand plan to develop ties between the two nations. The meeting took place through a video conference while Western powers continue to pile sanctions on Moscow. China and Russia have declared a no-limit strategic partnership since 2022, marking the fourth year anniversary of Russia-Ukraine war. Russian diplomat Yuri Usharov stated that Putin has accepted the invitation to visit China in the first half of his year. Let's listen in to what the leaders had to say.
Важно воспользоваться исторической возможностью, постоянно укреплять стратегические взаимодействия, вместе нести ответственность крупных держав во имя непрерывного развития китайско-российских отношений по правильной траектории.
Российско-китайских отношений можно это с уверенностью сказать, любое время года это весна. И хотел бы лично поздравить вас и в вашем лице весь дружественный китайский народ с новым 2026 годом и наступающим праздником весны. И наметили масштабные задачи по дальнейшему углублению двусторонней кооперации. Российско-китайское всеобъемлющее партнерство и стратегическое взаимодействие носит образцовый характер. В этом году мы отмечаем 25-летие основополагающего для наших отношений договора о добрососедстве, дружбе и сотрудничестве. Его дальнейшая реализация, безусловно, отвечает коренным интересам народов двух стран, способствует укреплению комплексного, действительно всеобъемлющего взаимодействия России и Китая.
В этом году
Россия в лидерах по поставкам в КНР энергоресурсов. Наше партнерство в энергетике имеет взаимовыгодный и подлинно стратегический характер. Ведем активный диалог в области мирного атома, продвигаем высокотехнологичные проекты, в том числе в промышленности и исследовании космоса.
We are now being joined again by Dan Perry. Thank you so much for joining us back here on NewsX World. What does Xi's idea of a grand plan for China-Russia relations really mean for their long-term partnership?
Well, I mean, China basically is a provider of a rescue umbrella for Russia, and in this way they create a client state, which is part of China's basic desire to have influence in the world. In general, the very nature of how China comports itself makes it impossible to have a significant sanctions regime against any rogue country. China buys almost half of Russia's oil, 47%, I believe. In the same way that Russia provides a market for Iranian oil. So if you're trying to create, to have sanctions on any country that is not China, you can pretty much assume that China is not going to play along, and because it's so huge, will help that country survive. And China provides Russia with more than just a market for its oil. They don't do direct military aid, but they are a major strategic and technological backstop. They provide them with vehicles and with industrial materials, and in this way create Russian dependency on China. For Russia, the interest is very, very clear. They are no longer completely isolated in the world, given the fact that a country that accounts for between a quarter and a third of global trade, and about a fifth of the global population, is a major ally. So that's a huge win for Putin. And combined with the fact that at least until now he's found a market for oil and other things in India, it has enabled him to survive what would otherwise have been crippling sanctions imposed by the West. So the mutual interest is clear. For China, there is influence and dependency created. For Russia, it's a life vest, basically, a survival tactic.
How important is this no limits partnership as Russia faces the Ukraine war and Western sanctions?
Hugely important. I would wonder if no limits means they're going to openly give Russia military aid, the way Iran had supplied it with drones. It makes Putin more likely to double down on a war that has become nothing short of a disaster for Russia, but not necessarily a disaster for the corrupt ruling elite in Russia, that in the context of a war economy has been able to further enrich itself amid their indifference to the loss of possibly up to 1 million Russian lives.
Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us here today on NewsX World. China has condemned what it's called US ideological bias following a ruling invoking a port linked to the Panama Canal. Beijing said the decision undermines fair market principles and accused Washington of politicizing economic and infrastructure issues. The comments come amid broader strains between the United States and China over global trade security and strategic influence. Let's listen in to what the Chinese diplomat Lin Jian had to say.
维护中国企业的正当合法权益。我想强调的是，美方的有关言行再次暴露自身冷战思维和意识形态偏见。谁在寻求霸占运河，谁在以法治之名行破坏国际法之时，国际社会有目。
We are now being joined by Mark Sutherland, joining us from London, who's a geopolitical commentator. Thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World. Why is China criticising the US as being biased over Panama's port decision, and what message is Beijing trying to send?
Good to be with you again. Well, the Panama Canal was very, very interesting because many years ago, under President Carter, who then gave up the American rights to that, there were many people that were very angry about that at that time. So there's a very interesting history, especially when you read books by John Perkins, The Economic Hitman, and I recommend people to look that up. It's very ironic to me that the CCP is accusing America in regard to this about being fair to markets, because I'm sure if we look at their policies that they are not. Also, America is very concerned about what's been going on in their backyard, as Venezuela has turned recently, where Maduro, they went in, took him out by a helicopter because they're very concerned about narco-terrorism, etc. And as Dan has just commented on in regard to Russia and where oil is sold, we look at this hegemony that China wants. China wants a multi-polar world, so that's why you've got BRICS. That's why Russia wants that, and you have to look at all these other links. And as I just say, finally, the Trump administration is looking at its backyard, and the trade routes in Panama Canal is extremely important in regard to the region there of South America, but it's also watching what other countries are up to. And China is up to a heck of a lot, especially under the Biden regime. You then saw thousands and thousands, if frankly millions of people going over their unsecure border in Texas, and that also involves China as well. So there's a lot playing out here, but the control of the Panama Canal, these contracts, is very, very important to America. Ellie.
And how does this dispute show the bigger picture of the US-China competition over global trade and strategic ports? Is the US supporting Panama's court decision reflect just the legal concerns, or Is it also about limiting China's influence?
Ellie, I think you've just said it in the last sentence, in the last few words. It is about Chinese influence. I completely hear what Dan was saying in regard to how much trade then China is responsible for. We have to look at the Belt and Road, how influential they have got into many countries around the world, where they come and invest that money and then demand mineral resources and etc. in payment for that. We also within the West have to look at from 1980-82, 55,000 plus factories, then manufacturing units, then left America firms over to China. You go back in history, you look at Nixon, Kissinger opening up China to the rest of the world. This has been a long time coming, especially whatever people think, whether it's conspiratorial, it's not, because it's laid out there, where people turn around and go, right, we want China to be the manufacturing hub of the whole world. And as the Trump administration has been fighting since President Trump came back in his second administration, which is to get firms back into America, get manufacturing back into America. It's all about this. Finally, it comes down to hegemony. It comes down to America fighting to continue to be number one, with China straight with hot on its tails to wanting to push America off that. And we just have to look at the CCP, what they stand for, communism, how they then run China, to look at the lack of human rights for various people over there. There's so much to discuss here, Ellie, and actually, as I say, it's about economic power and the ideology, in my humble opinion, that China then pushes and what they believe in. Ellie.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us here today on NewsX World. It's a pleasure speaking to you. Russia's Belgorod city has experienced severe blackouts following a Ukrainian attack targeting energy infrastructure in the region. Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov reported the extensive damage to the energy grid on February the 3rd, with emergency crews working through the night to restore electricity and heating. The attack comes as Belgorod, which shares a border with Ukraine's Kharkiv region, has been under constant threat since the start of the war in 2022. Gladkov stated that the repair work is still ongoing, but he expects more outages throughout the day as crews continue to fix the damage. He appealed to the public for understanding during this difficult period, with temperatures reaching extremely low levels. Let's listen in to what the governor Gladkov had to say.
В крайне сложный период времени, минусовую температуру с сильными морозами, с учетом больших повреждений нашей энергетики. Все находятся на рабочих местах и максимально стараются за максимально короткие промежутки времени выправить ситуацию. И здесь ждем результативности выполнения всех работ, исходя из объема вчерашних повреждений в результате произведенного ракетного обстрела объектов энергетики.
2 students were injured in a shooting at a school in Nové Mesto nad Váhom in Slovakia today. According to the police, one of the students fired an airsoft weapon at his classmates, with 2 students receiving immediate treatment. The police investigation is ongoing to determine if the act was intentional. Meanwhile, students and parents expressed shock, saying it was unimaginable in Slovakia, even though school shootings have been a regular occurrence in other countries. The school head confirmed the student who fired the weapon had a history of problematic behaviour, adding that the school had been working with counselling services. Let's listen in.
Na základe doteraz zistených skutočností, jeden zo žiakov mal vystreliť z airsoftovej zbrane na spolužiakov, pričom 2 žiaci boli jednorázovo ošetrení na mieste. Našťastie žiaci sú mimo ohrozenia života. V súčasnej dobe prebieha na mieste preverovanie, či ku skutku došlo úmyselným konaním.
Došlo k tomu vlastne voči chlapcom, ktorí sú absolútne bezproblémoví. A musím povedať, že žiak, ktorý vystrelil, áno, je problémový. A dlhodobo sme to riešili, spolupracovali sme aj s CPPčkom, aj s kuratelou. 2 žiaci, ktorí sú v podstate, 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 2 žiaci, ktorí sú Neviem dôvod, nepoznám dôvod, prečo takýmto spôsobom zareagoval.
That's all we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.